I have really been enjoying playing my Miu Mini and getting to re-experience some of those Game Boy Advance games that I used to play as a kid, but I still find myself going back to the PSP. I don't emulate the PSP. I don't have a device right now that's strong enough to do it besides my phone, which I find to be a little bit of a hassle, but we'll get into that later. What I do is I actually play the games on PSP hardware. I own a Vita. I could play them on there, but I really enjoy playing them on my original PSP, that nice smaller form factor screen. And if you're not familiar, or maybe you've been told that the GBA or just the Game Boy line in general has had the best handheld games of all time, I just don't simply agree. When I was about, I'd say 12 years old, I was a little bit too cool, I suppose, for Pokemon. I was kind of growing out of that, and I wanted to get a PSP. I remember getting the Daxter bundle with my birthday money when I would say probably about 12 years old, and I got rid of my Game Boy Advance and my Pokemon games, which I kind of regret, not long later, because I just found myself to be playing the PSP so much more often. I mean, this was a huge step. I mean, you may look at the gameplay that you see in this video today and think the PSP is, those graphics look ugly, but you're probably looking at it on too large of a screen, or you're not playing them on an emulator where they'd be upscaled and it would look a little bit better in that respect. I do think that the pixel art of the GBA era has aged better, but on a small screen, these were really good looking games, especially for the time period. But I think the thing that really defines the PSP for me, and I think that is often overlooked by the people who are, I guess, video game buffs in general, is just the middle quality games in this library. I'm not somebody that's super obsessed with, Crisis Core or Persona 3 or some of the games that really defined the PSP. What I'm more obsessed with are the games, particularly from early in the PSP's lifespan, like say 2005, 6, maybe 7, where somebody took a PS2 game and they said, you know what, we could probably squeeze this down onto the PSP. And they didn't try and make, a lot of shortcomings besides the obvious graphical ones, but they really tried to take the same modes, the same overall gameplay experience, and bundle it down into a PSP version. I am a huge fan of sports games, particularly American football games, and there just simply is not a great 3D football game on the Nintendo Switch. If you're familiar with the small team that makes the Axis football games, that's as good as you're going to get for a proper 3D American football game on the Nintendo Switch. That's a real shame because there's no Madden, and people will argue that Madden today is, kind of washed up anyhow. But back in the PSP era, you could play what was arguably a full-fledged console version of Madden with downscaled graphics, but all of the features really there on your PSP. These early Madden titles on the PSP I still come back to, and obviously Madden 12, the most recent one, isn't that much different than, say, Madden 08 on the PSP, but the sports games on this thing were really very fully fledged. We saw Tony Hawk Underground 2 come to this in a way that was quite in-depth and is a very full gameplay experience, and not something that you would have found, like, say, on the DS or even the 3DS, where it seems like there was a lot of compromises made to get a portable version of the game. They were always trying to slide in, different gameplay modes or change the game really overall as a whole. There was also a personal favorite of mine, NBA Street and NFL Street, which really felt like their full-fledged console counterparts here on the PSP. In addition to that, there was a ton of good racing games, be it like the Midnight Club series, ATV Off-Road Fury, which I think is often forgotten, MX vs. ATV. They all had games on this platform. Burnout. They all felt like they were the full console experience. And aside from ports that made their way to the Nintendo Switch, which in the case of sports and racing games is not nearly as robust as I think we had back in the PSP era, we haven't really seen games make their way to a handheld in the same way since. Obviously, graphical shortcomings on the PSP, but I just felt like the amount of content that they stuffed into a PSP game and the similarities of that content with its console counterpart is something that I feel like is very unique to the PSP in the handheld space. There was obviously Vita games that released that were quite similar to their console counterparts, but by this point in time, the gap between a PS3 and a handheld had kind of grown. There was only so many games that could get ported or had interest in being ported due to the Vita's, comparatively small library of AAA titles. that we're able to have that same cohesive experience between console and handheld. So while I feel like the PSP library is really second to none in its own unique way, and I think the games that most define it for me are not the ones that you see on everybody's, top 10 PSP game list. It's some more of these mid-tier titles. I do think the system is worth revisiting, but maybe not necessarily on the original hardware. If you do not yet own a PSP or a PS Vita, I think you're probably better off picking up some sort of emulation device. Because if you purchase a true PSP today, usually the cheapest way to get it is on eBay, buying one direct from Japan, which you can get for, say, $50, but then you're going to spend $20 on a new battery for it, because it's not going to come with a battery when you get one from Japan. You got $20 there to get a good battery, not a cheap battery. That's going to hold a minimal amount of charge, which is what one that comes with a battery is probably going to do, because the battery's going to be shot. So then you got $70 in it, and then you got to buy an SD card to put your games on, and you got to buy the adapter for the SD card. So you maybe got another $20 there. You could easily spend $90 putting together a PSP today, which I think at that point you pretty much could just bought like a POW Kitty X55, an emulation handheld that plays all sorts of systems. Granted, the PSP does too to some extent, but I think that its emulation is not nearly as good as what you'd find on these handhelds. But the problem is the POW Kitty X55 can't play necessarily 100% of the PSP games, and for that reason I wouldn't recommend it. I'd take a look at spending a little bit more money buying something like, say, the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, which you can get for $125 on the Retroid website. Should be able to play every single PSP game via the PPSSPP emulator, which is going to allow you to do things like upscale the game so the graphics look better. You can be able to use save states. You'll be able to use cheat codes much more easily. I just think it would be a much more fluid gameplay experience. So if you don't already own a PSP or a Vita, I don't think buying the original hardware is necessarily the way to go anymore, when $125 can get you a really good emulation device instead. I'm Bailey. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next video.